Hey everyone, and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. Today we're talking about how the game used to work. Why? Well, many of us have been here since the beginning, but at this stage I almost wonder if most of the people playing WoW maybe only started a few years ago. There are vast eras of World of Warcraft that had very interesting and different mechanics that impacted how the game was played, or at least are very memorable as curiosities. When a game gets as old as World of Warcraft, yet still manages to feel new, you can be pretty damn sure that its history is full of pretty interesting stuff that you might not have known about. All of that and more will be revealed in this video, which has been made possible by Skillshare. Sign up with my link and you will get 2 months for free. Yep, that's an extra free month on top of what you would normally get to, put that to use, learn new skills, something you can actually use, and it also massively helps out the channel, but more about them later. Let's kick it off with mutually exclusive reps. So TBC had a really interesting mechanic. There were 2 reps called the Aldor and the Scryers, and both of them did share a common enemy, but they were not friends, and players would pledge allegiance to only one of them. Each faction had unique rewards, and while it wasn't a massive factor, they did give your character a little bit more identity, and this all paid off when both factions narratively came together for the Shattered Sun offensive in the expansion's final patch, the Sunwell. Later on, Wrath of the Lich King would actually try a similar mechanic, though it was a lot more contained. It only involved one zone with Sholazar Basin, where you would ally with one of the region's 2 sort of opposing native factions, and again with some unique rewards for each. Overall though, I think this ended up being more interesting in theory than reality. You basically just would use Thoughtbot to work out what rewards you wanted, and you just went with Eldor Scryers based on that. But that said, the idea of optional factional allegiances, that could be super interesting, especially if the Alliance Horde split is kind of mended in BFA, but they still want something to replace it in the future. Next, we've got a big one, Justice and Valor points and their history. Justice points originated in the Burning Crusade as a way to guarantee progression for doing content. Now, today, you do a mythic dungeon, but if you don't get gear, that's it, you don't get gear. Previously, you would have got Justice points from the boss, and these did have a weekly cap, but the idea was that you would slowly always be progressing. And this evolved into a 2-tier system in Wrath, where you would get various currencies like Badges of Frost that ultimately fulfilled the same purpose, just that there was also a dungeon currency and then a raid currency. And these would eventually just be condensed into Valor points and Justice points, with your Valor turning into Justice at the end of a raid tier. This would be carried through both Kata and Mop, with Mists really changing it up. First, the item upgrade system was used sporadically to suck up Valor in that expansion and kind of maintain its value, and then second, the ability to purchase currency gear pretty much went away by the time of Siege of Orgrimmar. Now, I've got to imagine that with Thunderforging going so well, they thought that Warforging replacing them as a way of getting upgrades as you raided, I assume just thought that would work. Both currencies pretty much wound down after that. They had a really long run in the game, but there was a last hurrah for VP in the Mythic Dungeons at the end of WoD, where once again they were used for item upgrades. Now, with Legion, they were entirely replaced with Titan Forging. Opinion of this one has always been split, but I think it leans towards the currencies, because many did like how these currencies would guarantee progress, and essentially they'd give you daily and weekly incentives to do content. However, Blizzard feel that being able to get a dupe item of a higher item level via Titan Forging pretty much feels that niche in a way that they think is more exciting. Personally, I'd love to see a return to Valor in BFA, but we know that's not going to happen. Let's follow it up with a bit of a strange one, Warlock and Mage tanking. This was a strange thing that happened a few times during the game's lifespan. Now, Warlocks were often used as a spell damage tank. This is because of a mechanic that no longer exists called spell resistance, that essentially meant they would be able to survive incoming damage and somewhat mitigate it by rolling with a particular build. Now, interestingly, this actually did come into the game briefly in Mop. Blizzard added a glyph that gave Warlocks a new stance called Dark Apotheosis. It was pretty cool in that not only did it make you take less damage at the expense of dealing less damage, but it actually increased your threat generation and gave you new defensive abilities. It was initially strong to the point where it made you crit immune like an actual tank, but that was changed in the beta. Realistically, it was handy for soloing, and it could be useful in some particular circumstances, but from my memory, the most widely seen by people use of it was in high-level challenge mode dungeons. I especially remember Sparkog's video where the group was 4 DPS and a healer with him tanking as a Warlock, and that was pretty cool. Mage tanks have also been used in similar situations to the old Warlock tank, but in situations where it was more about their crowd control abilities, and that they were basically mitigating damage by preventing enemies from hitting them or their team. Plus, there were some scenarios like High King Mulgar where the mages were spell stealing a shield off one of the main ads. Stuff like this isn't really seen that often today, but I kind of love the idea, and oddly enough, Dark Apotheosis is something that we would kind of later see again with the Protection Warriors Gladiator Stance, which conveniently is the next topic. So Gladiator Stance will be familiar to most, as it was in Warlords of Draenor. Essentially, it was a bit of an experiment where Blizzard added a talent to Protection Warriors called Gladiator Stance, and it augmented and changed the Protection Warrior mechanics to essentially make them a DPS-focused spec that was aligned with the classic sword and board fantasy, focusing more on savagely bashing your enemy with a shield to do damage rather than defend against it. Now, this was a gameplay experiment that wouldn't last because the Legion Warrior revamp removed it from the game, and while it was a neat idea, it didn't really see a tremendous amount of use, if I remember correctly. Alright, raid reputations. This is something that has cropped up from time to time in the game, but you know what, it's pretty much stopped since 2013. So the idea of these was that as you complete raid content, you would gain reputation, and of course that would lead to rewards. Rewards that would be purchased with Justice or Valor points, which we covered earlier, though sometimes you just get free rewards for progressing, such as the Ashen Verdict Ring from Icecrown Citadel. Now, these raid reputations, I really think they were great. They essentially made it so that, like, all progress in a raid, everything you did was giving you progression, even if you didn't get gear, so you knew you were always working towards something. Now, these, along with Valor and Justice points, I think were really just a great motivational system to just keep on giving you rewards instead of having to rely on, say, Titanforged RNG. So really, raid reputations is something I'd love to see Blizzard bring back into the game. Alright, old attunements. So the old style of attunements is, it's so different to how things work today. Now, while Legion does have some attunements for things like Karazhan or the Suramar dungeons, attunements were a totally different kettle of fish in the Burning Crusade. Basically, it was this big, complex web of interdependent tasks for players to complete at endgame. Nowadays, you pretty much have one attunement. Do you have a high enough item level to get into a bit of content? Well, here's the chart of attunements in the Burning Crusade. It's pretty crazy, isn't it? And this had pros and cons. The not so good side of it is that it was a bit of a barrier to entry, and it wasn't that alt-friendly, though alts were just generally less common in those days anyway. And it also did mean that onboarding new members to a guild could be a little bit of a challenge because you'd basically have to run them through all the attunements. Now, this sounds like a lot of work, but in many ways humans, we're beasts of burden, and completing a task is satisfying to us. In this case, the attunement system pretty much took you on a journey through the expansion. More importantly, if you did get far, well, the chances are you were a pretty damn good player. I think they were probably good for the game in the sense that they always gave you a goal to pursue that wasn't just item level. And it certainly is something that I think Blizzard could maybe bring into the modern game in a good way, if they want to do it slightly deftly. Because right now, I think it is a little bit... I guess it's just a little bit of a problem that item level is such a, be-all, end-all aspect of the game, and maybe the content that you've done, if that was to take more of a focus, that could actually be good. Alright, Reforging. So, Reforging totally does deserve a place here, but we've kind of heard all the arguments before. Customizing your gear was really cool, but in reality, it just meant you used an add-on to calculate the best choice, and then you just did that. This effectively made the itemization of the game less impactful, plus it existed in a time where hit and expertise were a thing, which basically meant that players were using it to primarily balance those stats. So Blizzard felt like it wasn't needed after those were removed, but then, as time went on with WoD and Legion, we kept on finding ourselves in situations where secondary stats were super powerful, and this of course meant that players wanted to balance those stats out using a system like Reforging. Even though maybe Reforging would smooth over the problem, but it wouldn't exactly fix its core, root cause. Alright, let's talk about item upgrades. So these were first introduced in Mists, and the item upgrade system essentially allowed players to increase the item level of their gear by spending excess Justice and Valor points. This system had some really interesting implications. First, it acted as a game-wide nerf to content. Each week, players who capped their Valor points would get a predictable item level increase through this system, which meant that each week, raid content got just a little bit easier. Now, this aspect was important enough that it's why item level upgrades never came with raid patches. Instead, they would be activated with the follow-up minor patch to a major raid tier, like say patch 5.1. Now, previous attempts to do game-wide content nerfs, such as the ever-increasing nerf to Ice Crown Citadel, they were a bit less deft. Like, sure, they did the job, but they didn't create gameplay. This system had a similar nerfing effect, but it fed into the game's reward systems to create deeper engagement. More on that later. Now, it wasn't always perfect. Upgrading a bit of gear and then getting a lucky drop, which made it irrelevant, that kind of would feel a bit sucky. Plus, it ran the risk of all just being a bit too much, requiring players to cap VP on all important characters. But the thing is, it did work. Players stuck to the game more, and how do we know this? Well, in the twilight days of both Mists and Warlords, item upgrades were brought back in as a mechanic. Warlords of Draenor literally brought the VP currency back just for this, and that seemed to maintain player interest. So essentially, this was a way of just ensuring continued progress on your character every week that played into the Justice and Valor point system. The new way of doing it is Titan Forging. With it, you kill a boss, you keep on killing it, and you have a chance of progressing based on the RNG. Now, the less predictable nature of that, in Blizzard's words, is more exciting. Now, I find the Titan Forging to be a apathy machine, but obviously Blizzard have numbers which would counter that, and I suppose it comes down to a difference between what players say and what players do being something that's very different, and ultimately numbers are what will demystify that for you. Okay, old glyphs. So glyphs are really odd, and the glyph system just underwent constant change since they were first introduced. For new Legion players, it might surprise you that glyphs used to be a really major part of how you built your character instead of just what it is now, which is just some visual modifications. They actually changed your abilities, kind of like artifact traits or something like that, and again, more on that in a bit. So these were originally introduced back in Wrath of the Lich King as a new way to customize your character. Essentially, as you leveled up, you get new glyph slots, and filling those would allow you to customize your character's build. Now, the glyphs themselves were consumable items that you, for lack of a better term, kind of socketed into a glyph slot, and back in Wrath, a bit like with gems, putting a glyph into a slot destroyed the one that was already there. That's something that Cataclysm would change, with glyphs just being something that you learned on your character. Now, Cataclysm also had other very interesting plans for glyphs, and this is actually connected to artifacts in Legion. So, Cataclysm had a planned system called Path of the Titans that was supposed to have you unlocking these ancient glyphs. Now, Path of the Titans was scrapped, and much of the good stuff of it was reworked into a new system of prime, major, and minor glyphs. Glyphs would continue on from this point, but eventually Legion would just change them entirely. They no longer affect your gameplay, and they instead offer sort of cosmetic changes to your abilities. But some of the glyph DNA still is inherited from Path of the Titans. It exists in artifacts, and will likely persist on through Battle for Azeroth's Azerite gearing system. And today's video was made possible by Skillshare. Skillshare are an online learning platform with over 18,000 courses covering video editing, cinematography, business, art, technology, so many things. What I particularly love, though, is the courses are designed to be bite-sized and actionable, so you jump in there, you actually learn a few bite-sized things, and you come out and you're actually able to apply them. I've recently been enjoying Jordy's courses on color grading and DSLR filmmaking, and my link will give you 2 months for free, so it really is risk-free and helps the channel out a hell of a lot as well. So there you go, that's a bunch of really major gameplay systems that are entirely different as you go through the past of the game. Now, if you've been playing WoW as long as I have, none of this will be a surprise to you, but this video is more for people who started in Warlords and Legion, who are going to look back and think, holy wow, this was all really different. And at some point in the future, there are some really interesting niche mechanics and fun little interactions that I might cover in a future video, but yeah, this is kind of like a broad strokes to bring the new guys up to speed. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. A massive thank you to everyone over on Patreon for their support with the channel. Over there, there's behind the scenes, vlogs, and a whole bunch of other stuff, so you can check out the link down in the description. But with all that said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.